They gave me 25 years for the crime he committed. The smell of defeat was a mixture of diesel and old metal. Through the barred bus window, the city faded into a blur of indifferent lights, skyscrapers that had once been the playground of my future and now became tombstones of a past buried alive. Each jolt of the vehicle was a physical reminder of the fall, the hollow sound of the chains on my ankles marking the rhythm of a funeral march. Around me, the air was thick, a broth of fear and resignation exhaled by other women whose faces were maps of silent tragedies. I didn't dare look at them. Instead, I focused on my distorted reflection in the dirty glass, searching for the woman Leo loved, the woman he promised he would never leave behind. The loss of my freedom was a hole in my chest, but faith in his promise was the only thing keeping me from being swallowed by that emptiness. This prison was just a stage, a temporary obstacle in our story. True justice would come not from a judge, but from him. The journey ended in abrupt silence as the bus engine cut off. A guard, her face impassive as a statue, walked down the narrow aisle, her gaze sweeping over each of us with professional contempt. Beside me, a thin girl, not much older than a teenager, began to sob, a fragile, broken sound that was immediately crushed by the voice of authority. "Shut up!" the guard ordered, without even breaking stride. I looked away, fleeing from this public humiliation, and took refuge in the only fortress I had left: memory. Leo's voice echoed in my mind, warm and safe, as it had the night it all happened. "Trust me, Clara. I will never let anything happen to you. Never." The brutality of that bus aisle was insignificant compared to the power of those words. They were my shield, my invisible armor against the world. I knew what they thought of me. The deceived woman, the foolish accomplice who fell for the criminal. During the trial, the prosecutor used the word blind more times than I can count. But their blindness was greater than mine. They saw a crime, facts, evidence. I saw a proof of love, a desperate act by a man who would do anything to give us a future. This conviction wasn't the end. It was the ultimate test of my faith, the proof that I was worthy of his sacrifice. They could lock my body, imprison my movements, and label me with a number, but they couldn't touch the promise that burned within me, a secret fire that kept me warm in that cold of metal and despair. He would return. Arriving at Bedford Hills was like being swallowed by a monster of concrete and steel. The giant gates closed behind us with a final metallic clang, the sound of the outside world being surgically amputated. The air inside was different, heavy with the sterile smell of disinfectant and the underlying odor of hundreds of slowly decomposing lives. We were led through corridors painted a pale green, the color of nausea, under fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly as if mocking our silence. The sensation was one of total erasure. I was no longer Clara. I was a body being processed, a name on a clipboard, a problem being contained. With each step, I felt my identity crumbling, like old paint peeling from a wall. The betrayal I felt wasn't Leo's, but that of an entire system that dared to define me by someone else's mistake. The induction process was a ceremony of stripping, a cold, methodical humiliation. "Take everything off," said a guard whose face betrayed nothing but boredom. In a cold room, under her watchful gaze, the layers of my former life were stripped away. The dress I'd worn to court, the last piece of clothing connecting me to the woman I was tossed into a bag. In return, I received a rough, bleach-smelling jumpsuit that felt like someone else's shroud. It was then that she saw the small silver medallion around my neck. "This too," she said, holding out her hand. My entire body stiffened. It was a gift from him, with a barely visible L engraved on the back. "It's just a piece of metal. It's worthless," I lied, my voice a thread. She stepped forward and her eyes narrowed. "In here, we decide what's valuable." With a quick tug, she ripped the medallion off, the cold metal scratching my neck. The chain broke. The clasp was gone. In that moment, looking at her face, a face that couldn't see me, I understood the logic of that place. The goal wasn't to punish, It was to annihilate. They wanted to empty me of all memories, of all bonds, until nothing remained but the number they assigned me. Each confiscated object was a piece of my history thrown into the trash. But they were wrong. The more they took from me, the stronger Leo's presence became within me. He wasn't a medallion that could be ripped away. He was the blood in my veins, the air in my lungs. They thought that by stripping me naked, they would see my soul, fragile and exposed. But my soul wasn't there to be seen. It was out there, with him, waiting for the right moment to claim me. The cell was a cold concrete box, a tomb for the living. The sound of the metal door slamming behind me was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. A final punctuation mark for the end of my freedom. The air was heavy, smelling of mold and the despair of others who'd been there before me. From the darkness of the corridor came the sounds of the prison, a strange and frightening language. The echo of a guard's footsteps, a high-pitched scream from far away, followed by an even more terrifying silence, and the low, constant murmur of a prayer from the cell next door. The silence between the noises was the worst. It pressed against my ears, a physical weight that threatened to crush me. I sat on the edge of the metal bunk, the mattress thin and stained, and felt the walls pulsing, slowly closing in to suffocate me. A wave of pure panic shot up my spine, icy and paralyzing. My heart raced, beating wildly against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air grew thin, and I struggled to breathe, gasping. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the terror, but the image of the locked door was etched on my eyelids. That's when I began to whisper his name, a thread of sound in the oppressive darkness. Leo. Leo. Please. The words were an anchor, a focal point in the chaos of my mind. I repeated his name over and over, not as a request, but as an incantation, a spell to drive the demons from this place. You promised. You promised. Leo. Slowly, the rhythm of my heartbeat began to slow, synchronizing with the cadence of his name on my lips. I would survive this night, and all the other nights to come. I realized that fear was just another wall, another barrier to overcome. Leo knew this would happen. He prepared me, told me to be strong. This was part of the plan, the hardest part. My task was to wait, resist, keep our flame burning amidst this storm. Prison wasn't my destiny, it was my purgatory. Every second of terror I endured was one less second in the countdown to our reunion. Fear wanted to devour me, but I wouldn't let it. Because somewhere out there, my true freedom was planning its rescue, and every moment I resisted was a testament to my love and my unwavering faith. The days in Bedford Hills didn't begin. They imposed themselves. They were an assault on the senses, beginning with the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights that came on promptly at 5 a.m, bathing the cell in a cold, sickly light. That was the signal. The metallic sound of the cell doors unlocking in unison echoed through the block like the first shot of a daily battle. The smell was always the same, a mixture of disinfectant, sweat, and the subtle emanation of hundreds of confined bodies breathing the same stale air. My cellmate, whom I learned to call Maria, moved with an economy of gestures that only decades of incarceration could teach. She never looked directly at me, but I felt her gaze on me, a gaze that didn't judge but measured, assessing my chances of survival. Time in here, it wasn't a river, it was a stagnant swamp, and each morning was an effort to keep from sinking into the mire of hopelessness. I forced myself to focus on the promise I made to Lily, an anchor in the midst of that ocean of monotony and degradation. The routine was a ritual of depersonalization. The head count, where we had to stand, visible, to be numbered like cattle. Breakfast, a metal tray with something they called porridge, but which had the texture of glue and the taste of indifference. Then the march to the recreation yard, the only glimpse of sky we would have, a square of blue framed by high walls and barbed wire. It was there, in my first week, that I witnessed the fragility of order. 2 women began arguing over something trivial, a cigarette, a lingering look. The tension escalated with frightening speed. Words turned to shoving, and the shoving became a whirlwind of fists and hair-pulling. The guards intervened with efficient and practiced violence, separating them and dragging them into isolation. The rest of us just watched, our faces blank, as if watching a television program with the sound off. The incident in the courtyard was my first lesson in insolence. No one commented on what had happened. No one offered help. No one condemned. The violence was like a summer storm, sudden, fierce, and followed by a strange, heavy calm. That night, back in the cell, the silence was different. It contained the echo of the brutality we had seen. I reflected that the true prison, it wasn't the bars, but the web of unwritten rules, the constant need to project strength and hide vulnerability. The fight wasn't over a cigarette. It was over respect, over space, over a shred of control in a place designed to take it all away. I understood that to survive here, I would need to learn to navigate this dangerous ecosystem, to read the signs, to understand the language of looks, and to speak the language of silence. And above all, I needed to make myself invisible until I had a plan. My fight wouldn't be in the courtyard. It would be in my mind, in the invisible pages of my letters. The first real conversation I had with Maria happened at the end of the second week. I was sitting on the edge of my bunk, staring at my hands, wondering what they might feel like holding a pen again. The air in the cell was heavy, heavy with the weight of the empty hours that dragged slowly by. Maria was mending a sock with a makeshift needle and thread she'd probably unraveled from some fabric. Her movements were precise, hypnotic. She was an island of calm amidst the controlled chaos of the prison, a woman who seemed to have made peace with her fate, or perhaps was simply too tired to fight it. The sound of the needle piercing the fabric was the only noise in our small universe of concrete and steel. That methodical sound was strangely comforting, a rhythm of normalcy in a completely abnormal world. Suddenly, without taking her eyes off the sock, she spoke. Her voice was deep and a little hoarse, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "You won't last long if you keep staring into nothingness," she said. "Nothingness stares back, and it always wins." I was taken aback, not just by her speaking, but by the cutting truth in her words. I looked up and met her eyes for the first time. They were dark, deep, and devoid of any illusion. "I need to write," I said, the need escaping me like a sigh. "I need paper. A pen." Maria stopped sewing and stared at me for a long moment. A barely perceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. "Right?" she repeated, as if it were the most absurd idea in the world. "Girl, in here words are luxury. Luxury is expensive." Those words, "luxury is expensive," echoed in my mind. Maria had given me the key. Everything in Bedford Hills was a transaction. Respect, security, small comforts. Everything had a price. Forgiveness didn't exist, only exchanges. I had nothing of material value, but I had something that was perhaps even rarer there: knowledge. I had a mind trained to analyze, to find patterns, to solve problems. If I wanted paper and a pen, I needed to find a need and fulfill it. I began to observe, to listen. I noticed the women who received letters from lawyers and stared at the documents with helpless confusion. I noticed the mothers who wanted to write to their children, but whose hands could barely form the letters. My old life, that of a high-powered executive, seemed like a cruel joke here, but the skills that got me there, the ability to read, to interpret, to communicate, could be my salvation. Mine freedom, it would not be conquered with force, but with the one tool they could not take from me. My first client was a young woman named Rosa who shared my schoolyard schedule. She cried every day over a welfare document that threatened to take away permanent custody of her son. The text was dense, full of legal jargon that sounded like a foreign language. The smell of wet grass and dirt from the schoolyard contrasted with the sterility of the paper in her trembling hands. That piece of paper was the embodiment of her greatest loss, and she was drowning in the helplessness of not being able to understand him. I approached her cautiously, feeling the curious gazes of other inmates on my back. The prison hierarchy was rigid, and a newcomer speaking to someone outside her immediate circle was a breach of protocol, but the fear I felt was less than the urgency to put my plan into action. I offered to help. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, unaccustomed to being used for anything other than answering "present" at the count. Rosa looked at me suspiciously, her eyes swollen from crying. "What do you want in return?" she asked, the harshness of prison already ingrained in her speech. "2 packs of cigarettes from the cafeteria," I replied, repeating the price I'd heard Maria mention for other favors. "And paper, as much as you can get." We sat in a corner of the courtyard, and I read the document to her, translating the legalese into clear, simple Portuguese. I explained the deadlines, the options, what she needed to do. For the first time in months, I used my brain for something constructive. By the end, Rosa was no less scared, but she was armed with knowledge. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The next day, she handed me a small pad of yellowed paper and a ballpoint pen, rolled up inside a pack of cigarettes. Holding that paper and pen was an almost religious experience. They felt more valuable than any piece of jewelry I'd ever owned. The weight of the pen in my hand was the weight of my own rediscovered voice. This was more than paper. It was a promise of reconnection, a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated me from Lily. That small act of exchange, of using my mind to get what I needed, was amicable silent. It was the first time since the gate closed that I felt like the old Genevieve. Not the victim, not the prisoner, but the strategist. Maria was right. Luxury came at a high price. But the price I paid was a small part of my old identity. And in exchange, I gained the tool to build a new one. That transaction wasn't just about paper. It was about my redemption, guys, the first step to claiming my own narrative. That night, the darkness of the cell didn't seem so suffocating. For the first time, it offered a veil of privacy, a sanctuary. While Maria slept, emitting a soft, steady snore, I sat on the cold concrete floor, using the bunk as a desk. The dim light from the hallway was enough. I opened the small pad of paper, its rough texture under my fingers the most real thing I'd touched in weeks. The sound of the pen tip touching the first page was a seismic click in the silence of my existence. The smell of paint was the perfume of freedom, not the freedom to leave those walls, but to journey into myself and the world I had lost. It was an act of defiance, an act of love, an act of pure, stubborn survival. The words flowed. I began with the sentence I had mentally rehearsed that first terrible night. "My dear Lily, if these words ever find you, know that they were born in the darkest place, but were written with the brightest light I know. Your love." I continued to write, not about the prison, not about pain, but about a happy day. I described in vivid detail our last visit to the Bronx Zoo, the way her hair flew as she ran to see the lions, the sound of her laughter as a giraffe licked her hand, the taste of strawberry ice cream melting in the summer sun. Each word was a brushstroke, painting a picture of a world that still existed somewhere, a world where innocence and joy were real. I wrote for her, but also for myself, to remind myself of the woman I was before betrayal and the fall. As I wrote, immersed in the memories of that sunny day, his image emerged, inescapable. He was there with us at the zoo, smiling, holding my hand. I remembered how he lifted Lily onto his shoulders so she could better see the monkeys, how he looked like the perfect portrait of the man I believed he was. But as I tried to conjure the details of his face in that specific memory, something strange happened. The image became blurry, unstable. I remember his laughter, but I can't hear the sound. I remember his eyes on me, but I can't quite place their color in that moment. It was like trying to hold back smoke. A subtle but unsettling haze hovered at the edge of that seemingly happy memory. Why couldn't I remember something as simple as the color of his eyes that day? Was it the trauma, my brain protecting itself? Or was it something more, a crack in the foundation of the story I was telling myself? The pen paused mid-word, and a shiver ran down my spine, a premonition that the mirror in which I saw my past was somehow broken. News of my little service spread through the block with the speed of a whispered secret. In a place starved for any form of connection with the outside world, the ability to translate anguish into readable prose was a valuable currency. The courtyard, once a minefield of hostility, became my office. Women approached me, no longer with suspicion, but with a fragile hope in their eyes. They brought me their stories in fragments, appeals to judges, love letters never sent, pleas for forgiveness to distant children. I became the scribe of Bedford Hills, the weaver of words in a kingdom of silence forced. The smell of grass and damp earth mingled with the smell of cheap paper, and for a few hours a day, I felt an echo of my old life. Not the power, but the purpose. Every letter I wrote to someone else was a rehearsal for the letters I wrote to Lily, an exercise in keeping my own heart articulate. It was a way of redemption on a small scale, help those women build bridges with the words they lacked. My growing influence, however, did not go unnoticed. There was a woman, known only as Red because of her faded flame-colored hair, who watched me from afar. Red was an institution in Bedford Hills, a lifer who moved with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her eyes were shards of ice, and she saw hope as a contagious disease. One day, as I was helping a young woman write to her ailing mother, Red approached, her shadow falling over us like a bad omen. "Selling dreams, heiress?" she said, her voice low and thick with contempt. "You give them pretty words, and they give you cigarettes. But when the smoke clears, the bars are still there. The sentence is still the same." The young woman beside me flinched, but I kept my gaze firmly on Red's. "I'm not selling dreams," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. "I'm selling the one thing they can't take away from us, the chance to be heard." The confrontation with Red shook me, but not in the way she intended. Her cynicism was a dark mirror of the despair I felt that first night. She represented the easy way out, the surrender to bitterness, the acceptance of personas, the final identity. Her mockery forced me to question my own motivation. Was it truly hope I offered, or just temporary relief, a drug to make the captivity more bearable? That night, back in my cell, the need to write to Lily became even more urgent. I needed to prove to myself, more than to Red, that my past was real, that the love I felt for my daughter was a tangible force, capable of transcending these walls. Betrayal, the thing that put me here, destroyed my future, but I wouldn't let the poison of that place destroy my past too. My letters weren't a business. They were my act of faith, my only way to fight against the nothingness that Maria had warned me about. The nightly ritual became my sanctuary. The soft sound of Maria's breathing, the distant creak of a metal door, the rhythmic footsteps of the guard in the hallway. These noises, once terrifying, now formed the soundtrack to my concentration. They were the backdrop to my inner journey. The small patch of concrete beside my bunk was my island. The yellowed pad of paper was my territory. The scent of pen ink was the scent of my resistance. That night, I decided to write about something fundamental. The beginning of everything. I wanted to explain to Lily the decision that changed our lives forever, the moment I trusted him completely, not just with my heart, but with the future of our family. I wanted to paint a portrait of the man I loved, the man I believed was building an empire for us, so that one day she might understand the depth of my blindness and perhaps forgive me. I began to describe the night he presented the project to me. We were in our house, the rain gently beating against the library windows. I remember the fire in the fireplace, the warmth, the feeling of absolute security. He was standing there, gesturing passionately, explaining the investments, the projected returns, the miracle financial success he was about to achieve. His words were music, a symphony of promise and ambition. I sat on the leather sofa, mesmerized by his confidence, by his brilliance. I dove deep into my memory, trying to capture every detail for Lily. The color of his tie, the sparkle in his eyes, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was excited. And that's when the fog returned, thicker this time. I could hear the words in my mind, crystal clear. I could feel the emotion in the air. But when I tried to visualize his face speaking those words, the image shattered. In my mind's eye, the scene faded. The passionate man before me flickered and disappeared. In his place, for a dizzying instant, I saw myself. I saw my own reflection in the dark pane of the library window, bathed in the firelight. I saw my own mouth moving, forming the words I attributed to him. I saw my own eyes shining with the fever of ambition. The image lasted only a second, a bizarre, illogical overlap like a film with the reels reversed. I shook my head, the pen falling from my hand and making a small clunk on the concrete floor. My heart raced. What was that? The stress, the exhaustion, the pain of loss. Were they creating hallucinations, distorting my most precious memories? I tried to force the memory back to normal, to put his face back where it belonged, but the afterimage of my own reflection lingered, a smudge on the photograph of my past. The panic I felt was different from the first night. It wasn't the claustrophobic fear of the walls closing in, but an existential terror, the feeling that the very foundation of my reality was crumbling. If I couldn't trust the memory of the most crucial night of my life, what else could I not trust? Justice condemned me as an accomplice, and I always insisted that I was deceived, a victim of betrayal. But what if? The question was poisonous, too terrifying to finish. What if my memory was shielding me from a darker truth? What if the mist shrouding his face wasn't to hide his actions, but mine? Cold sweat trickled down my spine. I stared at the unfinished letter, the words about trust and love seeming like a cruel joke. I stood and walked to the small metal sink in the corner of the cell. Above it sat a small piece of polished steel that served as a mirror, distorted and stained, but functional. I stared at my reflection. I saw the face of a woman I barely recognized, the sunken eyes, the pale skin, the lifeless hair. But the eyes were mine. They were the same eyes I'd seen reflected in the library window in my fractured memory. Who was this woman in the mirror? Was she the innocent victim, the deceived fool? Or was she the silent accomplice who rewrote history so she could live with herself? In that moment, red scorn seemed almost prophetic. Maybe I really was selling dreams, and the first person I'd sold them to was myself. Doubt was a seed that, once planted, would begin to grow, its roots infiltrating every memory, every certainty. That man, the architect of my downfall, was becoming a ghost in my own story. And in his place, a shadow emerged, a shadow that looked eerily like me. Freedom seemed more distant than ever, not because the bars were high, but because the prison, the most inescapable thing, could be my own mind. The sound of my breathing was loud in the silence of the cell. The face in the mirror stared back at me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure who was looking back. The search for the truth about what happened was no longer about exposing his lie. It was becoming a terrifying quest to unravel the lies I might have told myself. The enemy I was struggling to understand might not be outside, but living behind my own eyes. The following months melted into a haze of routine and dissociation. I got a job at the laundromat, a humid, noisy hell where the steam from industrial washers mingled with the chemical smell of bleach. The heat was stifling, and the work was mechanical, mind-numbing. Folding rough sheets, stacking uniforms, feeling the warm fabric in my hands for hours on end. But I welcomed the physical exhaustion. It was a welcome counterbalance to the turbulence in my mind. The laundromat became my purgatory. As my hands worked on the automatic, my head was a courtroom where I judged myself repeatedly. The image of my reflection in the library window haunted me, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Every piece of glass, every polished surface, the metal of the machines, a puddle of water on the floor, became a portal to that terrifying doubt. The constant sound of the machines was a hum that drowned out my thoughts during the day, but at night, in thessalence from the cell, they returned with cruel clarity. My small writing business continued to thrive in the secrecy of the courtyard and hallways. I became a functioning part of the economy of prison in exchange for my words. I received not only paper and pens, but also extra coffee, a piece of fruit, and, most importantly, a certain degree of immunity. The women protected me, formed an invisible circle around me, because I was useful. I was their voice. But the irony was overwhelming. While I was bringing clarity to other people's feelings, my own story was unraveling into a tangle of contradictions and broken images. Red still watched me from afar, but her contempt was now tinged with a spark of curiosity. She didn't understand what drove me, and, to be honest, neither did I. My initial motivation, to tell Lily the truth, was being eroded by the terrifying possibility that I myself no longer knew what the truth was. The final break came on a gray winter afternoon. A guard, an older woman named Mrs. Gable, who had a reputation for being strict but fair, called me out of the laundry line. My heart sank. Being singled out by a guard was rarely a good sign. She led me through hallways I'd never seen before, away from the noise and chaos of my block, to a small room that housed the prison library. The smell of old paper and dust filled my lungs, an aroma I hadn't smelled in so long it almost made me cry. "I hear you have a knack for words," Mrs. Gable said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The woman who ran this place has been transferred. The job is yours if you want it. Sort the books, help with requests. It's quiet, better than the steam." The offer was a miracle unexpected, a lifeline. A job at the library meant almost unlimited access to paper, and above all, it meant silence. A silence that I both desired and feared. The library became both my refuge and my torture chamber. I spent the first few days in a state of reverent ecstasy, running my fingers along the spines of the books, inhaling their scent, marveling at the worlds contained within those pages. The work was simple: cataloging donations, repairing torn books, helping the inmates find something to read. It was there that I reconnected with old friends: Fitzgerald, Wharton, Dostoevsky. But the books were also traps. A passage about passionate love, a description of a devastating betrayal, a character struggling with guilt. Everything seemed to speak directly to me, amplifying my doubts. One day, while cataloging a stack of donated paperback novels, I came across one whose protagonist was a master manipulator, a man who charmed everyone while weaving a web of lies. I began reading, and my blood ran cold. The character's tactics, the way he isolated the heroine, the way he distorted her reality, were frighteningly familiar. Reading that book triggered a new flood of fragmented memories. I remembered conversations with him, moments when I'd expressed concern about investments, when I'd questioned the legality of certain transactions. In my earlier memories, he'd always had a logical answer, an explanation that calmed me. But now, those same memories replayed themselves with one crucial difference. I couldn't hear his voice. I could only remember the sensation of being soothed, of my own anxiety dissipating. Who had soothed me? Was it his words, or was it my own desperate need to believe him? I began leafing through the letters I'd already written to Lily, which I kept hidden under my mattress. My descriptions of him were vivid, passionate, but they felt more and more like a character in a book, a literary creation, rather than a real man. The man I'd described with so much love and so much pain was becoming a stranger. Maria noticed the change in me. I became more withdrawn, more haunted. I would spend hours in the library in absolute silence, even after my work was done, just staring at a page without reading. One night, she broke the heavy silence in our cell. "You encountered a ghost in that library of yours," she stated, not asked, as she sewed in the dim light. "I know that look. It's the look of someone who is haunted by themselves." I ignored her, but she persisted. "In this place," she continued, her voice low and serious, "your mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy. It keeps you sane, or it builds you a cell within a cell, one you will never leave. Lausies freedom, out here it's easy to understand. Thelosoph herself in there. That is the true life sentence." Maria's words hit me with the force of a physical blow. She had given my terror a name. I was building my own prison inside, and the bars were made of my own unstable memories. That night, I made a dangerous decision. I needed to face the most traumatic memory of all, the source of all my suffering, the day of my arrest. If I could find the truth there, perhaps I could begin to free myself. I waited for the prison to sink into its nocturnal stillness. I picked up my paper and pen. The plan was to write to Lily, not about the event itself, but about the feelings, the shock and confusion, as a way to process it for myself. I closed my eyes, forcing myself back to that morning, the doorbell ringing, the housekeeper opening the door, the police officers entering, their faces serious, their movements efficient. I was in the dining room, drinking coffee, the porcelain cup in my hand, the smell of fresh coffee and croissants. I tried desperately to place him in the scene. Where was he? Was he beside me? Was he in the office? I strained, searching the dark corners of my memory, searching for his face, his voice, any sign of his presence. Nothing. The memory was vivid, sensory. The morning light streaming through the window, the glint of sunlight on the polished mahogany table, the sound of the police officer's shoes on the hardwood floor. I remembered my own heart pounding wildly. I remember asking, "What's going on?" And then, the moment they said my name, the charges, the word accomplice, I remember the cold handcuffs on my wrists, and as they lifted me, I looked down at the mirrored surface of the dining table, and the only person I saw reflected there, her face contorted in a mask of shock and terror, was me. Alone. He wasn't there. The pen slipped from my trembling fingers. A dry sob escaped my throat. He wasn't there. In all my memories of that moment, every time I told the story to my lawyers, to myself, I put him there. I described him trying to intervene, looking as shocked as I felt. But it was a lie, a fabrication, a scene my brain created to make sense of the chaos, to give me a clear villain and absolve me of any responsibility. The man whose betrayal I lamented for years, that the man I blamed for destroying my life, wasn't even at the crime scene. That simple, devastating fact reshaped my entire reality. If he wasn't there, then who signed the final documents? Who authorized the transfers? Who looked the investors in the eye and lied? The mirror in my mind no longer showed just a reflection. It showed an accomplice. And that accomplice was me. The question lingering in the darkness of the cell was no longer, how could he do this to me? But a far more terrifying question, what have I done? The revelation didn't break me. It sprayed me. The woman who returned to the cell from the library that night wasn't the same woman who had entered. The floor of my already shaky identity had cracked open, and I was free-falling into an abyss of myself. The laundry work, red cynicism, the routine of prison, all of this became background noise, insignificant compared to the cataclysm that had occurred in my mind. The ghost wasn't him. It was the story I'd invented to survive. I spent days in a functional torpor, my body moving through the routines of prison, while my soul was trapped in the loop of that false memory. The smell of books in the library, once a comfort, was now the smell of fiction, and I was the greatest fiction of all. Every love story seemed like a mockery. Every story of betrayal, it felt like a distorted mirror of the civil war raging inside me. I needed proof, an anchor in the objective world to keep me from completely drowning in the treacherous subjectivity of my memory. The library, my former refuge, became my research ground. I began obsessively searching for anything related to my case. I used the prison's library request system to request access to newspaper archives from the time of my trial. The wait for these materials was torture, days of anxiety gnawing at the edges of my sanity. While I waited, I read about psychology, about trauma, about the tricks the mind plays to protect itself from unbearable truths. The words dissociative amnesia and psychogenic fugue leaped from the pages, clinical terms for the horror I was experiencing. I wasn't just searching for the truth of my crime. I was searching for a diagnosis for my shattered soul. Maria watched me with silent concern. She saw the fever in my eyes, the way my hands trembled as I leafed through a book. One night, as I stared at the cell wall, lost in thought, she finally spoke, Sometimes, she said softly, her needle moving in a steady rhythm, truth is a very bright sun. If you look directly at it, you go blind. Then the mind creates a veil, a cloud, so you can survive the light. Her wisdom, born of decades of observing human nature at its rawest, was more insightful than any psychology textbook. The problem, she concluded, is when you forget the veil is there. You start thinking the cloud is the sky. I didn't respond, but her words resonated with me. The man I loved and hated, the architect of my downfall, was my cloud. And now it was dissipating, revealing a sun I feared would incinerate me. The search for forgiveness others seemed a distant luxury. First, I needed to face the crime I had committed against my own mind. The day the newspaper microfilms arrived was a low, gray day, a perfect reflection of my mood. Mrs. Gable handed me the box with a curious look, but she asked no questions. I loaded the roll into the ancient reading machine, the hum of the device filling the room. Silence from the library. The smell of dust and old celluloid was thick in the air. With trembling hands, I flipped through the newspaper pages, skimming headlines of a world that had gone on without me. And then I found it. A picture of me on the front page. I was being escorted from the courtroom, my face pale, my eyes empty. The caption read, "Genevieve Dubois, the silenced heiress, receives 25-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy." But it wasn't my picture that stopped my heart. It was a smaller picture, on the fold of the page. It was a picture of him, the first clear image of him I'd seen in years. And the name beneath it wasn't the one I remembered. It was another name. And the caption read, "Vincent Moretti, the prosecution's star witness, leaves the courtroom after his testimony." Prosecution witness. The sentence exploded in my mind, destroying the last pillar of the narrative I had constructed. He didn't betray me by disappearing. He betrayed me on the witness stand. He wasn't the mastermind who deceived me and fled. He was the centerpiece of the case against me. He sat in that courtroom, looked at me, and told a story that put me in this position, prison, for the rest of my life. The shock was so intense that I felt the breath knocked out of me. My hands gripped the table to steady myself. I looked at his grainy photo, at the smug smile on his lips, and the fog in my memory didn't just dissipate, it was ripped away with brutal violence. With the image of his face finally clear in my mind, the other memories, the memories I had suppressed, began to emerge from the depths. And the memory that came to me was that night in the library, the fire in the fireplace, the rain on the window. But this time, it was different. I was alone. I was standing, pacing, talking aloud. But it wasn't my voice. It was a quieter, more assertive voice, filled with an arrogant confidence I'd never possessed. It was his voice. I was having a conversation with myself, playing both roles. I was the anxious Genevieve, expressing doubts, and I was the confident Vincent, countering every worry with cold, ruthless logic. "It's brilliant, Jen. No one will ever find out," his voice said, coming from my own throat. "They trust you. They see the heir, the mother. They will never see the predator." I remember going to the mirror over the fireplace, and for a second of absolute horror, the face that stared back wasn't mine. It was his. The scream I stifled was a ripping, primal sound. I jerked away from the microfilm machine, stumbling backward until my back hit a bookshelf, sending several volumes crashing to the floor with a thud. Mrs. Gable rushed into the room. "What's going on here?" she demanded. But I couldn't answer. I was trapped in that moment, in that mirror. Miracle Financial. Thebe Trail, the fall. These weren't the actions of two people, a victim and a villain. They were the actions of a mind at war with itself. He wasn't my boyfriend. He wasn't my partner. He was my alibi. The persona I created to carry out the acts that good Genevieve would never admit to. The part of me that was ruthless, ambitious, and willing to cross any line. The accomplice in the mirror was, quite literally, me. I sat on the library floor, surrounded by fallen books, and began to laugh. It was a terrible laugh, devoid of humor, the sound of a mind breaking apart, or perhaps reforming itself into a new, monstrous form. Mrs. Gable stared at me, her face a mixture of alarm and pity. I understood everything. Why my memories of him were so hazy. Why he was never truly there at crucial moments. He only existed when I needed him. When frightened, Genevieve needed confident Vincent to take control. And when the scheme fell apart, he did the only thing a personality bred for self-preservation would do. He sacrificed me. He presented himself as the perfect witness, the deceived lover, and told the jury exactly what they wanted to hear, ensuring that only one of us would go to the prison. The irony was so profound, so perverse, that it bordered on insanity. I spent years in this cell lamenting the loss of myself, when the truth was that I never knew who I was. I was not a woman, but a stage where two personalities fought for control. The search for justice to clear my name was a sham. Whose name was I supposed to clear? Genevieve's, the victim, or Vincent's, the perpetrator? The line between innocence and guilt wasn't just blurred, it didn't exist. Freedom no longer meant leaving those walls. It meant integrating or destroying the other person who lived inside me. The laughter turned into a silent sob. The truth I had sought so long did not free me. It sentenced me to a prison fare more terrifying than Bedford Hills. The cell was no longer concrete and steel. It was made of the bones of my own skull. And I was locked inside with my worst enemy, who was also my creator and my destroyer. Time stopped flowing. I sat on the cold library floor, the smell of dust and old paper invading my senses, but the only reality was the white buzzing inside my head. The fallen books around me were like wreckage from a shipwreck, and I was the sole survivor on a desert island of my own self-consciousness. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her face, normally a mask of professional indifference, now showing a crack of genuine concern. She said nothing for a long moment, just stared at the epicenter of my devastation. The sound of my own breathing, irregular and shallow, seemed obscenely loud in thessalence that followed my breakdown. I was no longer a woman mourning a betrayal. I was a riddle to myself, an impossible equation whose answer was either madness or an even more terrible truth. The prison around me, with its concrete walls and steel railings, felt like a safe haven compared to the crumbling architecture of my mind. Mrs. Gable approached slowly, her footsteps surprisingly soft on the linoleum floor. She didn't touch me, didn't offer words of comfort. Instead, she did something deeply human and unexpected. She knelt beside me and began gathering up the fallen books one by one. Her action was a silent act of order amidst my chaos. Sometimes, she said, her voice low and calm, the stories we read break us, and sometimes they show us how to put the pieces back together. She placed the last book back on the shelf and then extended her hand to me. I took it. Her hand was firm and warm, an anchor in my sea of unreality. She helped me to my feet, and for the first time since arriving at Bedford Hills, a guard looked at me not as a number, but as a person. The walk back to my cell was a funeral march. Every step echoed with the newfound truth. Vincent, Genevieve, two sides of the same crime. When I returned to my cell, Maria looked at me and knew immediately. I didn't have to say a word. She saw in my eyes the ghost I had finally found. I dropped onto the bunk, the cold metal against my back, and stared at the gray ceiling. The journey to find justice had ended in a dead end inside my own skull. I was not the victim I sought redemption, nor the villain who deserved punishment. I was both. I was the living paradox of a war I waged and lost against myself. The key now wasn't what would happen next in the outside world, but what would happen next inside me. The question was no longer, who am I, but how can I live with both of us? The real sentence wasn't 25 years. It was the forced coexistence with the architect of my own destruction, who was also, in some perverse way, my protector. I spent the night in a feverish state of wakefulness. I didn't sleep. Instead, I traveled through the ravaged landscapes of my memory, now illuminated by the harsh light of truth. I saw Vincent emerge not from love, but from necessity. He was born of my repressed ambition, my desire to play the corporate game with the same aggression as the men around me. Something good Genevieve, the educated heiress, would never allow herself. He was my armor and my weapon. He made the tough decisions. He was the face in the mirror when I needed to be ruthless. But the armor became a second skin, and the weapon developed a will of its own. The musty smell of my cell felt like the smell of my own psychological decay. Loss it wasn't my freedom or my daughter's. It was the loss of control over my own upbringing. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since the first night. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel on purpose. But this time, I wasn't looking for myself. "Vincent," I whispered, and the name sounded strange and intimate in my own mouth. "I know you're there." The charade is over. There was no visual response, no Hollywood transformation, just me, my weary face staring back at me. But I felt a shift, a subtle vibration in the depths of my consciousness, a recognition. The conversation that followed was entirely silent, a battle of wills waged on the battlefield of my mind. I didn't try to exorcise him. I tried to understand him. I demanded to know why. And in the silence the answers came, not in words, but in waves of emotion and images. I felt his fear of being weak, his fury at a world that underestimated the woman who raised him, his cold logic that the sacrifice of one, Genevieve, was necessary for the survival of the other, him. This silent dialogue has become my new ritual, faith. What I had once placed in an external justice system, I now placed in my ability to negotiate an internal peace. My writing changed. I continued to help other women, but my words now carried a different weight. I saw the dualities in all of them, the loving mother and the angry addict, the faithful woman and the desperate thief. I stopped writing letters to Lily. What could I tell her? The truth was too complex, too monstrous for a child. Instead, I started a new journal. A journal addressed to no one, or perhaps to myself. In it, I documented the negotiation. I set boundaries. Vincent would no longer control my actions. He could exist as a memory, as the source of my strength and my downfall, but Genevieve would be in charge. Forgiveness. What I was seeking now was for myself, for having fractured myself, for having allowed one part of me to destroy the other. Years passed. Red's hair grew silver, and his hostility toward me turned to grudging respect. Maria was freed, a day of bittersweet joy that left me with a deep sense of loneliness and gratitude. I became the permanent librarian, the silent guardian of stories in a place that tried to erase them. The library was my kingdom, an ordered universe of words that contrasted with the chaos I had tamed within myself. The smell of the books was the scent of my hard-won sanity. I still felt Vincent's presence, especially in moments of stress or anger. He was an echo, a shadow in the corner of my mind's eye. But he was no longer the pilot. He was merely a passenger, and I had learned to live with his silent presence. One day, years after my revelation, I received a letter. It was from Lily. She was already a young woman, and her words were cautious, filled with a pain I could only imagine. She didn't ask for explanations. She just wanted to know if I was okay. I held the letter, the thin paper trembling in my hands. Time had stolen her childhood from me, but maybe she hadn't stolen everything. I took a clean piece of paper and for the first time in over a decade, began writing a letter to my daughter. The handwriting was firm. The words were honest. I hadn't told her about Vincent. Not yet. But I hadn't told her lies either. I'd told her about loss, about repentance, and about how, within the prison, I finally found a kind off-freedom, the freedom to truly know myself. My life in Bedford Hills continued, one day at a time. The legal sentence was never overturned. But the sentence I had imposed on myself, that of being a victim, had been commuted. I accepted my duality. I was the accomplice and the deceived, the creator and the destroyed, The mirror no longer showed me an enemy. It showed the totality of who I was, with all my flaws and fractures. Miracle was not to find the truth, but to survive it. My redemption wouldn't come from a judge or a parole board. It came from the daily act of choosing integration over annihilation, of holding the two halves of my soul together with the strength of my own will. And in the silence of my cell, surrounded by the stories of others, I finally understood my own. My story wasn't about betrayal, it was about a civil war, and the peace that came after was not one of victory, but of an exhausted and hard-won armistice. The bars were still there, but I had found the key to the only prison that really mattered. And that key was, and always has been, acceptance. When the mirror fell silent, I understood. The truth does not liberate, it weighs. But in its weight there is a kind of redemption that forgiveness cannot achieve. In my heart, guilt became a bridge. And the reflection was not condemnation, but reunion. They say the worst prison is the one we build within ourselves, but it is also the only one we can escape from if we have the courage to face ourselves. And you? What would you do if the enemy that destroyed you lived inside your own mirror? Where does justice end and mercy begin? What is truth when the heart decides to lie to survive? If at any point in this story you saw yourself in me, share. Someone might need that light. Write in the comments, which part of Genevieve's mirror reflected her soul? And before you leave, remember, the light doesn't ask for permission, it just comes. Subscribe, activate the bell, and stay with me. Because some truths can only be faced together.